Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Disability Policy Research Forum here in the Washington, D.C. offices of Mathematica Policy Research. I'd also like to welcome everyone who's attending today via our webinar. My name is Angie Jaszczak. I'm a senior survey researcher here at Mathematica and also Mathematica's project director for the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Individual Characteristics, which is the project we'll be hearing presentations about today. So the Center for Studying Disability Policy was established in 2007 to help build the evidence base for sound, effective disability policy. We host these forums to share the research findings so they can be used to improve disability policies and programs across the nation. So we have a great panel of speakers today for all of you. First, we're going to hear from my colleague Frank Marrone, a researcher here at Mathematica, who will discuss findings from a review of matched data sets aimed at gaining a better understanding of the employment experiences of individuals with disabilities who are participating in federal programs. Next, we'll hear from Purvi Sevak, a senior researcher at Mathematica, who will share results from the Survey of Disability Employment, also known as the SDE. She's going to be focusing on differences of employment experiences for VR applicants with psychological and physical disabilities. Next, we will hear from Debra Brucker, a researcher at the University of New Hampshire's Institute on Disability, and she will present her findings also from the SDE, discussing variations in social capital among vocational rehabilitation applicants. And finally today, we are honored to have Joe Marrone here as our discussant to share his thoughts on what impact these findings might and should have for vocational rehabilitation personnel, technical assistance centers, and other researchers. Mr. Marrone is a senior program manager for public policy at the Institute for Community Inclusion at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He brings to us over 40 years of experience in policy and programs related to employment, workforce, and rehabilitation issues for people with disabilities. I do have a few quick housekeeping items for us today. Remember, we have both an in-person and an online audience. So for those of you who are participating in the webinar, feel free to submit questions electronically using the Q&A panel on your screen at any time during the forum and the presentation. And then after the presentations and after the discussant, we'll alternate between questions in the room and questions on the web. And also, as a nice reminder for those of us here in the room today, if you could please silence your cell phones, we would definitely appreciate that. And a note that we are also recording today's webinar, so we'll post it on our website next week. Before we get started, I did want to provide just a small bit of background about the project and today's presentations. So advances in medicine and technology have made it feasible for people with significant chronic impairments to work productively. Yet despite these advances, as well as the protections offered by the Americans with Disability Act, individuals with impairments continue to have persistently low employment rates. So the papers that we hear today are conducted under the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Individual Characteristics, which is also known as the IC-RRTC. You'll hear that phrase used today. And I'd like to take a minute first to thank our, and acknowledge our project officer at the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, that's Hugh Berry, as well as our project director, principal investigator from the Kessler Foundation, John O'Neill. Also, I'd like to note that the findings and conclusions that are presented today are those of the authors and do not represent the policy of HHS or NIDLR. And the authors retain sole responsibility for any errors or omissions today. So just a final word before turning it over to our first presentation, our first presenter. Today's speakers are going to share what we know about employment differences among individuals with disabilities, as well as implications for VR agencies. Our first presenter will discuss administrative data sets and what these can tell us about these differences. So he will present highlights from a growing body of research that has used matched administrative data from the Social Security Administration, as well as from the Rehabilitation Services Administration, to follow individuals with disabilities who are pursuing employment over many years. Our next two speakers will present findings from the Survey of Disability and Employment, also known as the SDE. The SDE was designed and conducted by Mathematica Policy Research for the purpose of learning more about the employment and employment-related efforts of adult VR applicants in the periods leading up to their application. We surveyed 2,804 applicants between the ages of 25 and 60 from 3 state VR agencies. So let me turn it over to our first presenter.
Great. Thanks, Angela. I appreciate it. As she mentioned, I'm going to highlight findings from a review of literature of studies that use matched data from SSA and RSA administrative files. Now, the Social Security Disability Insurance Program and the SSI program, Supplemental Security Income Program, are very, very important to millions of Americans with disabilities. There are almost 9 million SSDI awardees, nearly 5 million SSI recipients. And the VR program is probably one of the largest, most important employment-only programs for people with disabilities to help them return to work, stay at work, or gain educational skills that could help them return to work. And what policymakers are very interested in is the question of how do these two programs interact? What are the outcomes for individuals with disabilities who enter the VR program with regard to SSA? So the purpose of this study was to find the research studies that actually use the matched data, data from each program to better understand those outcomes. So I'm going to highlight some of those findings that you could only discover if you use the matched data as opposed to one data set alone. And then we'll consider some of the strengths and weaknesses of the studies. First off, we identified 14 completed studies, and here I've listed some of the authors of these studies. I'd like to highlight Hugh Berry and Paul O'Leary in particular for their important work in securing the data use agreements that allow us to conduct these matched data research studies. Now, the data sets that I'm referring to are quite substantial. There are millions of records available through the SSA disability analysis file, or DAF. This is the database that is used to maintain the program information, the disability characteristics, the outcomes for disability recipients on SSI or SSDI. The RSA 911 is the official closure file for RSA, for vocational rehabilitation clients across the country. We've been able to match these files as far back as the 1998 fiscal year, and the SSA disability analysis file has records for individuals who have received at least one benefit in 1 month from 1996 through 2013. Now, another important file is the master earning file. Now, this is a file from the IRS, which includes annual earnings information for about 96% of the U.S. population. This is a restricted use data set, so the only people who have access to it are the IRS or official contacts from SSA. So any of the studies that I mentioned that include earning actually had some involvement of an SSA representative as well. Now, in addition to the size of these data sets, there are some other important strengths of note. Most importantly, by using these data sets, we can identify cohorts of individuals and follow them over time. So, for example, all individuals who applied for VR services in the year 2002, we can identify that group and follow them over time to see what their outcomes are. That's something that you can't necessarily do with the RSA 911 data alone. Similarly, for the DAF, the disability analysis file, you can identify cohorts of SSDI awardees or cohorts of SSI awardees or even individuals who are concurrent beneficiaries. Because the VR data is generated at the state level, each state produces its own RSA data, and then it's aggregated at a national level. We could also examine variations in outcomes by states, as well as the individual characteristics, educational levels, et cetera, that those VR agencies collect and include in their data sets. So now I'm going to just jump to some of the findings. So what have we learned from these match data? I think one of the first things that's interesting is that many first-time VR applicants are already SSI or SSDI beneficiaries at the time that they apply, about 8.4%. And this is from 2002, the 2002 first-time applicant cohort. If we included individuals who had applied to VR and went through services and then came back and reapplied, the number would actually be pretty much higher. But for this study, we didn't look at that. We only looked at first-time applicants. Now, what this means is that, a substantial number of people are not in, people who apply for and enroll in VR are not recipients of SSI or SSDI at the time of application, about 91%. But as you'll see, that changes quite significantly over time, which is what the match data allows us to see. This graph shows the growth in SSDI participation after VR application. And what you'll see is that there is quite a substantial growth. And just looking at the 1999 cohort, that's the purple line, second line. I don't have a pointer, which is what I was asking. If I had a pointer, I could show you this much better. But in 1998, at time of application, there were about 2.8% of the first-time VR applicants were SSDI beneficiaries. And that number increases substantially over time. By 36 months, the number increases all the way up to about 14% by 60 months. What's also interesting here is that the increase in SSDI at time of application increases for each cohort year. So you can see the percentage receiving SSDI at application from 1998 increases each year at time of application all the way to 2003, from roughly 1.5% to just over 6%. And there's a corresponding increase at 60 months from 14 to about 17 or 18%. SSDI program entry also varies substantially by state. The match data indicates that SSDI entry in some states is 2 to 3 times as high as some other states. For example, South Carolina and Puerto Rico are on the lower end of that scale. Massachusetts and New Hampshire are on the much higher end of that scale. Among some of the bigger states, larger states that serve VR clients like Texas and New York, they have actually relatively lower rates of SSDI entry. Now, return to work outcomes for SSDI beneficiaries also varies by states. And these data reflect SSDI beneficiaries in the first 5 years after their benefit award. And what's important here is that this graph illustrates 3 important return to work outcomes. Service enrollment in VR or an employment network, trial work period completion, and suspense or termination due to work. And similar to the previous slide, we can see that there's variation by state in these important employment outcomes, particularly for trial work period and suspense or termination due to work. Service enrollment is a little bit more variable, but still consistent with a trend by state. Now, I should also note these figures here have been adjusted for differences in demographic or other beneficiary characteristics. And the authors of this study also considered unemployment rates in each state as well. Okay. Now, a small percentage of the total SSI, SSDI beneficiary population actually receives services, about 7 to 10%. And amongst that group, about 40% increased their earnings after VR. And about 20% of that group forgo at least some benefits due to work. However, a much more substantial group, about 80%, actually go to work and have earnings without ever enrolling in VR in the first place. Now, For those who do go through VR and are successful and have earnings and have long-term earnings, SSA makes reimbursement payments to the VR agencies when the beneficiary has reached what's known as a substantial gainful activity level earnings for about 9 months. However, the payments are only made for a small percentage of VR clients. About 4% of the DI or SSI beneficiaries who apply for services are those that reimbursement payments are made for, and 6% of those who actually receive services. Now, that doesn't sound like a huge number, but the benefits foregone due to work for those clients is actually much higher than the payments that SSA makes to VR agencies for the services received, about 7 times higher. Now, that study doesn't include some information with regard to the total amount of expenditures VR agencies have to spend, in addition to the services provided, like the operational costs, for example. Another thing that we don't know from this study is that we don't know what the benefits foregone would have been if SSA had not paid the VR agencies at all. Now, the Ticket to Work program is another important sort of policy component that's been examined using matched data. Ticket to Work was rolled out in 2002 through 2004, and it provides opportunities for beneficiaries to have more options in terms of their return to work opportunities. One of its main goals is to encourage beneficiaries to use VR and employment network services, return to work if they're capable, and then to exit the benefit roles. And that was the purpose of Ticket to Work. And the studies have shown fairly convincingly that Ticket to Work did increase enrollment in VR and other employment networks, but it did not have a measurable impact on earnings or SSDI benefits foregone due to work. Another interesting finding concerns waiting time for VR services and subsequent VR and SSA outcomes. Now, waiting time typically refers to the time between a person applies for VR services and they are deemed eligible for services, and the time from eligibility to the time and point where they actually receive services. This is an important measure because generally the longer people have to wait for services, the more challenging it could be for them to remain motivated, to stay involved, to stay engaged. And what these studies have found is that the longer the waiting time between application and services, the poorer the outcomes for the beneficiary. Individuals are less likely to achieve substantial earnings and more likely to receive SSI or SSDI benefits. And I should just make a note, and based on some of these findings related to waiting time, there are new interventions being tested in the state of Kentucky and in Minnesota that incorporate some of these elements of trying to speed up the pace of services to see if the outcomes are better for SSDI-only beneficiaries. Now, there are a couple of other recurring themes that emerge, one related to age and the other education level at time of VR application. Generally, the younger the applicant, the more likely the individuals are to have more successful employment outcomes, under 40 in particular. In terms of education, individuals with a post-secondary educational attainment or higher at the time of VR application tend to have better employment outcomes as well in terms of returning to work and non-payment due to a suspense or termination due to work. Now, as I mentioned when I started, the policymakers are mainly interested in the extent to which VR can help improve employment outcomes for SSA beneficiaries and for VR clients as well. But one of the problems with these studies is that there is not a control group in most of the studies that is completely comparable to the individuals who receive VR services. VR, it does not randomize people to receiving VR services and not receiving VR services. So there's no counterfactual. People who apply to VR services might be substantially different from those who don't. They could be more motivated. They could have different characteristics. So without knowing the counterfactual, it's difficult to say conclusively that VR causes employment outcomes, successful employment outcomes. So certain findings, like the waiting time finding that I remarked, is suggestive of potential success, but we need to test those interventions in order to find out if they really do work. Other strategies, such as in the Ticket to Work program, where the program was rolled out in different states, allowed for an opportunity to test two groups that were similar on all different levels, because the ticket went in the first phase to individuals who were eligible to receive the ticket, and then there were states that did not receive it who were also eligible, so they could compare the outcomes for those two groups to identify the impact on service enrollment and the impact on earnings. So I'd like to wrap up and say that there's been, a tremendous amount of information, new knowledge gained through research using matched data. Probably one of the more important aspects is the ability to conduct longitudinal analysis following cohorts of individuals over time and compare them. So if a new policy is put into place, and I'm thinking, for example, WIOA is recently put into place, we can look at cohorts of consumers before and after WIOA and track them over time to see what influence some of the new policies and procedures VR agencies and others put into place might have on client outcomes. A lot of other research using these matched data are also underway. A couple that focus specifically on transition age youth, individuals ages 16 to 24, with serious mental illness and the receipt of post-secondary training, and a few that are looking specifically at those who do and do not receive services. And I think that's about my time. So if you have questions, you can contact me at my email or phone number here. And I'll turn it over to Purvi.
Thanks, Frank. I'm going to talk today about some work that we've been doing looking at the barriers to employment that individuals with disabilities face and some of the factors that may help them. For this information, we've turned to VR applicants to learn more about their experiences. As we just heard from Frank, we've learned a lot from administrative data from SSA beneficiaries and VR clients. We've also learned a lot from existing survey data about the employment experiences of individuals with disabilities. So some of what we know is that there are large differences in employment by type of disability, by race, education, and state of residence. In many cases, these differences go above and beyond differences in employment across these groups in the general population. But what these surveys and administrative data sources lack is information on why these differences might exist. We can speculate on why they might exist. There might be differences in barriers to employment or social supports or employment supports. So we designed the Survey of Disability and Employment to collect information to learn more about these potential barriers and facilitators to employment that might explain why some groups fare better in the labor market than others. Before I go into detail, I want to share some select findings that I'm going to present today. In the SDE, a majority of VR applicants in 3 states reported that it's very important to them that they work. However, that health problems restrict work, and that also many non-health barriers restrict their ability to take part in employment. We also heard that many applicants receive a number of workplace accommodations. I'm going to focus my presentation on differences in responses between VR applicants who report having physical disabilities and those who report having psychiatric disabilities. And after I present, Deb Brucker is going to present findings on, that show that applicants who are not employed at application have more limited access to social supports than VR applicants who already are employed. So Angie provided a little bit of an overview of the SDE, and I'm going to just take a few minutes to discuss a little bit more. So to collect information for the SDE, we interviewed about 3,000 applicants to state VR in 3 states, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Ohio in 2014. We contacted applicants as soon after their VR application as possible, and as a result, we interviewed individuals, in most cases, before they actually received services. We interviewed individuals who may not have received services even by now. So we wanted to collect this information very close to their VR application. Among other topics, SDE interviewers asked applicants about their impairments and health conditions, their employment history, reasons they're not working, receipt of accommodations, and social connections. The SDE also covers other topics. I mentioned these because these are the ones we're going to cover today. And as I said, our presentation today is going to compare responses of those who report physical impairments versus psychiatric. I'm going to present those findings, and then Deb Brucker will talk about differences in social capital by employment and type of disability. The work I'm going to present today, I'm going to focus on differences between individuals who report physical disabilities only and those who report psychiatric impairments only. In my paper, I also separately report responses for those who have both physical and psychiatric impairments. I want to start by noting that because our sample is only among applicants in 3 states, that the SDE is not nationally representative. In fact, there's notable differences across the 3 states in the respondents. This slide shows the percent of SDE respondents in each state that report having physical disabilities only, psychiatric disabilities only, or both physical and psychiatric disabilities. And what we see is that in Mississippi, a much higher share of VR applicants report having physical disabilities, about 60%. Relative to New Jersey and Ohio. In New Jersey and Ohio, a relatively higher share compared to Mississippi report having psychiatric impairments. So it's important to keep these cross-state compositional differences in mind as I present differences by type of disability. So some of those differences might also reflect differences in where these applicants live. So we started by asking VR applicants, how important is it that you work? We know that motivation and the extent to which an individual is interested in working can be an important determinant in employment outcomes. And what we see is first, there's similar responses between individuals with physical versus psychiatric disabilities, but that in general, VR applicants place great importance on working. About half of the applicants say it's extremely important that they work. Another third say it's very important that they work. About 12% say it's somewhat important, and only 5% say it's not at all important that they work. The slight differences between individuals with physical and psychiatric disabilities in these responses are not statistically significant differences. So despite placing great importance on working, we also found that over a quarter of respondents have not worked in the last, or worked for pay in the last 5 years. This graph shows the distribution of SDE respondents by the number of years since they've worked at the time of their interview. While a third of respondents are employed at application or when they were interviewed, and about another 25% have worked for pay in the past year. Over 25% of individuals with physical disabilities have not worked in the past 5 years. So it's been 6 or more years since they last worked for pay. And about 35% of individuals with psychiatric disabilities last worked for pay 6 or more years ago. So we know from the economics literature that as more time goes between since one was employed, the likelihood of returning to work falls. A positive take on this is that our finding suggests that there's a lot that can be done to get people to VR sooner, and that maybe the sooner they do receive VR services, the more promising the outcomes might be. Okay. So we asked SDE respondents who are not currently working why they left their last job. Among individuals with physical disabilities, the most commonly cited reason was health. 45% of SDE respondents with physical disabilities said health was the main reason they left their last job. Among individuals with psychiatric disabilities, the most commonly cited reason was that they were fired, with about 40% saying they left their job because they were fired. A significantly smaller share of individuals with physical disabilities report that as the reason for leaving their last job, and a substantially or significantly lower share of individuals with psychiatric disabilities report health as the primary reason for leaving their last job, though still a substantial share. Of all the other reasons cited, childcare, transportation, or that they didn't need or like to work were cited about by 5 to 10% of respondents. So a related question we asked, but slightly different, is why are you currently not working? And again, a number of reasons were cited, a number of barriers. Here we report the percent that report the top 6 reasons that were cited. So about 70% of the respondents reported health as a reason for not currently working. But then we see a number of non-health related reasons for not working. 50 to 60% said it was because they couldn't find a job. And about 25 to 50% reported some of these other reasons, including that they were discouraged from previous attempts at working, that employers wouldn't give them a chance, lack of skills, or that the workplace was not accessible. Here we see a number of statistically significant differences in the reasons reported by individuals with physical versus psychiatric disabilities. Individuals with psychiatric disabilities were more likely to report that they couldn't find a job, that they were discouraged from previous attempts, that employers wouldn't give them a chance, or that they lack skills. Individuals with physical disabilities were more likely to report workplace accessibility issues as a reason for not currently working. So while I just reported high reports of barriers to employment, we also, respondents also reported high rates of receipt of a number of accommodations that helped them work. So we asked respondents whether they received particular accommodations at their most recent job. This would be for people currently working at their current job or for those not working at their most recent job. And here I report the accommodations that were most commonly cited. About 50% reported receiving a flexible schedule. About 40% reported receiving help from a job coach or training. 30% received assistance from coworkers. And 20 to 30% reported having modified job duties that helped them work. Here, the only accommodation for which we saw statistically significant differences in reports by type of disability was modified job duties, where a slightly higher share of individuals with physical disabilities reported having modified job duties compared to those with psychiatric disabilities. So next, Deb Brucker is going to share some findings from her research about a potentially important facilitator to employment, social capital.
Thanks, Purvi. Again, I'm Deb Brucker from the University of New Hampshire, and I know I'm the last person before we get to hear from Joe's stimulating remarks, so we'll try to go quickly through this. I'm working with a team on the social capital piece of the Survey on Disability and Employment, and the rest of my team is at the Kessler Foundation, John O'Neill, who is here, as well as Amanda Botticello and Ann Kutlick, so I'd like to thank them for working on this with me. We're interested in looking at variations in social capital by employment and by disability statistics for VR applicants. And by social capital, what we mean are social relations or social connections, your sense of community involvement, how much you're engaged in the community that you live in, the amount of support you can get in a community. It's beyond just your Facebook friends, but people you could actually rely on to support you and give you assistance, live people in your town, if that makes sense. So if people have high levels of social capital, we say they have a lot of participation in their community, a high number of supports that they can rely on. And conversely, if you have a low level of social capital, you aren't really participating much in the activities of your community and you don't have a lot of people that you can rely on for supports. So hopefully you have an idea of what social capital means, but it's important to note that we're interested in social capital as it relates to employment. And high levels of social capital can increase opportunities for employment as you have a greater network in the community. But if you're employed, it also increases your social capital. So it's sort of a bi-directional relationship that's important to keep in mind. It's not necessarily a causal where one increases the other without working the other direction as well. There's been a lot of prior research on social capital in general, although not for VR applicants. For the general population, we found in prior research that higher levels of social capital are associated with better education, employment, health, political participation, safety, and well-being. Some research on people with disabilities and levels of social capital has found that overall levels of social capital are lower for people with disabilities than for people without disabilities, and that they do vary the levels of social capital according to labor force participation, where people that are either working or actively looking for a job have higher levels of social capital than other persons. So in the Survey on Disability Employment, there were 4 questions that we picked out that looked at areas of social capital as they related to employment. And this slide shows those questions, which remind me a lot about, I have 2 teenagers, so a lot of questions about, can I borrow money? Can you help me get to work? I don't have transportation. Help with a serious personal crisis that makes it difficult for them to find or keep a job, or help finding a job. And just straightforwardly, descriptively, about 2/3 of the applicants have access to people that can help them find a job, get to work urgently, or help with a personal crisis. Fewer people, significantly fewer people, have someone they could rely on to borrow money to pay an urgent bill. So given the past research, we wanted to dive a little bit deeper and look at variations in social capital by disability characteristics, not necessarily type. So we decided to look at severity of disability, which we defined people with severe disabilities as persons having independent living or self-care disability, or 38% of the sample identified that way. We also wanted to look at the age of disability onset to see if differences existed in that way. And then also health status. And then we wanted to look at that all within the framework of whether or not people were currently working or not. And 36% of the sample was currently working. So controlling for demographic variables, including age group, gender, race, educational attainment, and marital status, we found that applicants who are employed had much higher levels of social capital than applicants who were not employed at the time they came to VR. Applicants with better health have more access to social supports. Applicants with severe limitations have less access to social supports. And people who acquire disability at age 25 or older have less access to financial support than people who acquire disabilities at age 17 or younger. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the possible policy implications, but these point to some more acute sort of needs for services and supports within the community. So our key findings are that more than a third of VR applicants are already employed and likely to have strong social networks. And social networks can be important in maintaining employment, not just obtaining employment. But most VR applicants are not employed and thus are likely to have limited social support in the community. So they may need help not only with job search and preparation that VR usually focuses on, but also with accessing acute services to address financial issues, crises, and transportation concerns. VR applicants with more severe limitations have lower levels of social capital, so community-based services may need to fill those social support gaps. And VR applicants with better self-reported health have more social capital. We don't know exactly the direction of that relationship, and so further research could help us determine whether or not improving health would result in increases in social capital, which may in turn help with employment retention or entering employment. So this is a summary slide for the whole survey on disability employment. Just to reiterate some of the points that Purvi had made, that applicants with physical and psychiatric disabilities place great importance on work. However, they cite a number of health and non-health factors that make work difficult, which points to the potential to tailor counseling to address external factors that may be affecting employment. We also find high rates of receipt of a number of accommodations, which is very encouraging for those people who are employed. But the finding that a quarter of VR applicants who have not worked in the past 5 years suggests that agency outreach could decrease the number of years people are waiting before reaching out to VR to pursue employment. Although this survey wasn't nationally representative, the SDA provides insights into the needs of VR clients. Counselors and agencies may be able to use this information to better serve their clients. The IC-RRTC is working with Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities to integrate the findings from this study into their needs assessment. The results from this survey also, I think, highlight the importance of some legislation that was recently enacted, the ABLE Act, that is designed to help people that are SSI eligible set up tax-free savings accounts similar to 529s, so that they have a financial resource that they could rely on. And there are some pending bills trying to improve access for that program, allowing people with age of onset of disability up to 45 or 46 to be able to contribute to those programs as well, so that they have their own source of financial support instead of relying on the community. So for more information, you can stay tuned there's a special forthcoming issue of the Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation, which will include the paper on social capital as well as other papers examining employment outcomes for VR populations. And here's my contact information and Purvi's contact information. And I believe I will turn it over to Joe, or you? Okay.
Just quickly step in first.
Okay.
I'll just quickly step in for a second and thank our presenters, and then remind those individuals who are attending via the webinar that they can still submit any questions that they have through the Q&A panel on their screens. So it is my pleasure now to turn it over to Joe Marrone, who will talk about his thoughts on the impacts of the findings presented today. So, Joe, it's all yours.
Thank you, Angie. One of the problems that Angie told you, she read from the bio, I've been in the field, 40 years, right? That's what I said, give or take. is that you tend to, or I tend, particularly growing up in the South Bronx, to ascribe to the Lily Tomlin philosophy, who said once, no matter how cynical you become, it's never enough to keep up. So one of the dangers of both social science research we do and listening, and I'm pretty much up on various literature, is one of the things I've recommended to our research department is we coin a motto that says, we prove what others already know. And one of the dilemmas of any kind of research, particularly for people in the field, is it seems too simple. You know, it doesn't take a lot of research to say people who are poor have more problems. The voc rehab system and lots of systems have a long way to go. That if you have better relationships and you have more peer support, if you have more kinds of supports, you're liable to do better. So on one hand, it's pretty simple. On the other hand, the hard part is to say, what do we do with all this information? Because we know it, but all right, what are you going to do with it? So Dave Stapleton and Gina Livermore sort of hooked me up with this. Said they wanted me to be eloquent, humorous, and provocative. And I said, you've got to give me more to work with, you know, at Mathematica. So one of the problems when we went through this is I understood each of the things, but I was trying to say, how would I tie this all together? Because I saw them in some ways as disparate, even though the SDE was related to both Debra and Purvi. So I just have a few thoughts on various aspects. First of all, in terms of look at the 9/11 data. I used to work for voc rehab, and I know both the strengths and the limitations of voc rehab and data. One of the things that strikes me is I do a lot of work with particularly mental health researchers. And they're always complaining about the 9/11 data, how spurious it almost is, and how, you know, it's really hard to dig into it. As someone who works in both DD, or in developmental disabilities, mental health, and voc rehab, 9/11 is like heaven compared to the data you get from DD and mental health. I mean, in developmental disabilities and mental health, just finding out who's employed is very tough. We collect data on developmental disabilities from state systems, but what they report are who in employment services, not who's employed. And if you talk about mental health, it's even worse. The SAMHSA data that some of you are familiar with in terms of the employment outcome, or the people in the adult mental health system who are employed, no one believes, even the people at SAMHSA. So I think one thing we should acknowledge is that the 9/11 database, for all its faults, and its major fault is that it's obviously only on closed cases. You know, there are other obvious issues about what do some of the data sets really mean. But I think we should acknowledge that it's a lot easier if you're into massaging data to look at the 9/11 data and at least get some sense of facts than it is trying to parse through the developmental and mental health systems. I was doing a presentation last year in another state, and I had my slides, and I have some stuff about employment and outcomes. And this fellow I didn't know before, but he turned out to be sort of one of these real gurus about data collection in mental health. He's written textbooks and everything. And he said, oh, I really like that. He called me up afterwards. He said, Joe, because he obviously didn't know me when I tell you what the question. He says, I know you're interested in employment. He says, what kind of sophisticated data elements do you recommend? I said, sophisticated data elements. I'm happy if people can tell me who's employed and who's not. Never mind who's working and how much they're working. So I think we have to acknowledge that if we're talking about employment capitally, one of the things we really have to do is, and mental health and developmental disabilities are worse, as you know, is to basically be able to identify who is employed and what are they doing and what are they making before we get to the more elaborate kind of constructs. The other thing which was clear from a lot of the presentations, Purvi and Debra mentioned that the survey was only for 3 states. If you surveyed 50 states, you'd get 50 separate pieces of information about what VR does, how they do it, who they reach out to. And that's both the strength and the weakness of the system. One of the strengths of the system is that there's a lot of flexibility in voc rehab. One of the dilemmas for the system is that people, even within a state, say, I go to an office in Silver Spring and they tell me one thing, and I go to an office in Baltimore and they tell me the exact opposite thing. So that's a dilemma. It's a dilemma for researchers saying, when we're surveying 3 state VR agencies, are they presenting the same services? They operate under the same law, but are they presenting the same services? And so one of the things we have to obviously we acknowledge, but I think one of the things certainly people like me struggle with when we work in various states, and I know the folks here struggle with, is if I'm finding out something about Mississippi, Ohio, Maine, whomever, what is that telling me? Am I just finding out about them, or am I getting some information about the VR system as a whole? And it's a little bit of truth on both sides, but I think we need to sort of examine, and I don't know the best way. I know certainly from a technical assistance point of view, I really try to go in and dig in to say, how do you actually deliver services in your state? But when you're looking at these big data sets, it's very hard to make sense of what does that say about the VR system if we're talking about national policy. Because in some ways, we're learning more about the Mississippi system or the Ohio system than we are learning. And I guess the other thing I would mention, just in terms of the voc rehab, it's not just a characteristic of the clients, and these folks know it, but I just want to be clear. It's not just a characteristic of the clients that affect some of these things. It's how the people that they work with are helping them. So when people talk, for example, about accommodations, sometimes you need help in getting accommodations. The other issue with accommodations, just because it came up again at the end, is a lot of people get help on the job that they don't think of as an accommodation. And so it's very hard when you do a survey and you ask people specifically about, did you get an accommodation? Some people think very clearly about what that means. Other people just don't assume that somebody helping them out a little bit is an accommodation. The other issue in terms of that kind of survey data is this whole idea. I guess it's not a surprise, certainly shouldn't be a surprise that people who are hooked up with voc rehab by and large say they want to work. Because there's a lot of ways to not get to voc rehab if you really don't want to work. As we all know who's worked in the field, what does that mean for an individual who comes in when they say, I want to work? For example, it's commonly cited statistic in mental health that 70% of people with serious mental illness say they want to work, and yet the employment outcomes of people with mental illness are terrible. That's true at one level, but if you're working in the field, 70% of your clients in mental health don't come in and say, get me a job right now. They're ambivalent for a lot of obvious reasons, whether it's benefits, whether it's because they've had trouble in the past, whether they feel they've been discriminated against. So parsing out from a practical, what do you do with this information, in terms of people who say they want to work, what does that mean? And one of the struggles voc rehab agencies have, it's not strictly motivational interviewing, but it's along those lines, is what do we do with people who are along this continuum of saying they want to work, but exhibit various behaviors that either inhibit that or enable that? And one of the struggles voc rehab has had over the years is they've been seen, and sometimes accurately, as a very closed system. As you have to come in, and you have to kind of prove yourself. And then we might help you and we might not help you. And one of the struggles VR has to be seen as a much more open system. I was doing a presentation a few years ago when I was in a hotel room, and it was right outside the pool area. And I was talking about VR access. And I was thinking beforehand, and I'm looking out at the pool and seeing, everybody's got these pool rules. And I said, that's a metaphor for a lot of our systems, including VR. There's a nice swimming pool out there. There's a piece of paper that has the pool rules. There are 10 of them. They all start with no, and none of them talk about swimming. And that's part of the issue in terms of these systems. And we're talking about VR, but that's true in a lot of ways of mental health and DD. You have systems that are set up to help people, and yet how, in fact, do they demonstrate that they have to prove themselves to the clients as opposed to the clients proving themselves to them? And that's one of the struggles at a practical level. Another thing in terms of Social Security I wanted to mention, because Frank mentioned our study, because Mathematica is involved. We have a big rehab services grant, and it's actually our only randomized controlled design, working with Minnesota and Kentucky, looking at an intervention about how do we put together a different intervention for people on SSDI. And the reality is there's not going to be a lot of great outcomes in terms of people getting off SSDI because one of our requirements through the funding is we can only do things that voc rehab had control over. And anybody who's worked in the field of Social Security and disability knows there's a lot of other things that impact people's choices about going on or off Social Security. But the interesting thing is we created this design based on some studies we did and some data Mathematica helped us with. And basically it's a three-pronged design that involves a voc rehab counselor, a financial educator, not a benefits counselor, a financial educator, and a placement person who get involved with people right from the beginning. And any of you who are familiar with voc rehab will be surprised at these two things that are involved. One is part of the design is to have to go from application, that the day they walk in the door, to getting a plan of action within 30 days. The average length in voc rehab now is about 4.5 months. So that is, to my mind, we'll be successful if the system doesn't blow up with that, because that, people think 4.5 months is too quick. So to go from application to eligibility to plan in 30 days is amazing. The other thing, which is a little bit more subtle, but is important in terms of some of the support issues and some of the issues from the survey, is that we have a financial educator, not just a benefits planner, because we help people deal with some of the finances, including Social Security benefits. But we intentionally do a plan of action that says, where does money fit into your life goals? How does your need for finances fit into what you want to do with your life, what you need in your life, your need for supports, your need for value? So it's very much pulling the financial stuff into not just how do I manipulate work incentives, but really talking about what value do finances play in my life? Like, do I want a house? Will it help me meet somebody? Will it help me develop social capital? So I think those are two aspects of excuse me, of our randomized controlled design. And so far, as I said, the outcomes, it's still pretty new. It's still in process. But what's interesting is we've been able to hold pretty much to that 30 days from application to plan of action, which is shocking. And as I said, if we do nothing else except do that, I think it's amazing. I guess a couple of things specifically about the survey. One thing we know, this fits into, once again, we prove what others know, but it's good to have some facts, because sometimes we think we know things that we have to disprove, such as the long talk. Over the years, we thought we knew sheltered workshops were a way to get people to work. And it took a lot of data to say, well, that's not a way to get people to work. So just because this common wisdom holds a lot, sometimes the common wisdom is common ignorance more than common wisdom. But one of the things that struck me, number one, about the survey data is clearly, which I assume folks here understand, people with mental illness have a hard time getting employed. Now, the hard part, if you're going to help people, is to say, well, what's getting in the way? We used to think that the illness itself was the major barrier, but there seems to be lots of other things. Social capital, how much help you got, discrimination. So one of the issues that a lot of states are struggling with is how do we help people deal with the impact of serious mental illness? Now, what there's been a lot of research on is something called individualized placement and support, evidence-based supported employment, which is an excellent model of helping people move from unemployment to employment in programs. The problem with that is we've got about 25 years of research on that show we can help programs. But that research has not influenced the ability of mental health systems of care to increase the percentage of people working within their system. The average in the national average currently is about 18% of people in the adult mental health system nationally have any kind of employment in any given year. And that figure hasn't changed much. It dipped a tiny bit during the recession, but basically it's been pretty consistent from about 14% to 18% over the last 20 years, even with a lot of the evidence. So one of the struggles researchers have, technical assistance people have, practitioners have, is to say, okay, we know all this stuff. What are we going to do about it? What's supposed to be the impact on us in terms of we can't just nod and collect data and go to webinars. We have to do something different about it. And then finally, in terms of social capital, that's a tough one in terms of voc rehab, because I think, as Debra mentioned, it's not something voc rehab normally thinks about. I think at some level they do. They certainly, at least in theory, the voc rehab system tries to help people develop jobs that fit their needs in terms of the environment they want to work in, the kind of work they want to do. So in theory, if you're in a nice work environment with pleasant coworkers, that will help build up social capital. That doesn't always work in practice, because you're dealing with the intersection of perhaps the limits of the voc rehab system to help you, people's own skills and abilities, because there are a lot of people with, for example, mental illness who are doing quite well, but they're not the ones who come to the Voc Rehab system, as you heard. So you're dealing with people who might have limited skills. You're dealing with staff who may not be as helpful as they need to be. And you're dealing with the labor market, depending on where you are, that may or may not be amenable to anybody, or particularly people with mental illness. So the balance between the ideal kind of job, because one of the things we know is that long-term unemployment is terrible for your physical and mental health and has an impact on social capital. The other thing we know is that a particular job can be very bad for your physical and mental health. And often the kind of jobs where you don't feel like you had any kind of support, whether official or unofficial, or being able to develop any kind of friendships or any kind of linkages, tend to be jobs that people identify as more stressful. That those kinds of things have much more impact in some ways on the job than the actual job duties themselves. So in terms of Voc Rehab, what are some of the things in terms of social capital? I think number one, you can think about it, like Debra said. One of the things we've done in some states, for example, is when we help people with the job, we don't just do a job placement plan, we do a job support plan. What kind of supports do you need on the job, official and unofficial, to make the job useful for you and valuable for you? Because we know that a lot of people have problems on the job, but one of the dilemmas that people with disabilities have is when problems come up on the job, everyone ascribes it to the disability as opposed to normal transition problems. So one of the things we've tried to do is to say what kind of supports make sense, and part of those supports are what labeled natural supports. I think in some ways social capital is kind of a better way of thinking about natural supports. But we've tried to develop prior to actual moving into the job, developing a support plan. The other thing, which I don't think we use as well in the field, but certainly this whole idea of peer support. That was the genesis of the independent living movement, of mental health recovery centers. This whole idea of building up kind of social capital. Once again, people didn't conceptualize it like that. They conceptualized it as peer support. But peer support is basically a way to develop social capital. And one of the things Voc Rehab and mental health systems and DD systems can do a better job of is how do you connect people with enough kind of natural supports, relationship supports. And then finally, I'll just end that, obviously I think you saw some of the data. Social capital with youth, with people, younger people, is different than social capital with adults. For one thing, many young folks just don't gravitate towards these club kind of environments. It's just not, the current environment is that people don't gravitate to these kind of large group things. So when we talk about how do you develop peer support for young people, particularly young people, say, with mental illness, you run into the issue of the barriers that their behaviors bring. With people with developmental disabilities, you run into either protectiveness of family or maybe stigmatization by other folks who don't want to be associated with them. So one of the things we think of, how could VR deal with social capital better, is to also think about structurally what kind of support structures are in a state, independent living centers, mental health recovery centers, peer support groups for people with developmental disabilities. What kind of social capital can you build up structurally, not just worrying about one-to-one? Because one of the things we found, I do work with a research and training center about youth with mental health and employment, is the link between children's mental health and the world is non-existent. I used to run a mental health center, and I was very involved with mental health as a consultant for a lot of years. But it was a real eye-opener to me, because the gap between children's mental health and even adult mental health is wide. So some of you may have heard about healthy transition grants. Another research thing I'm involved in is looking at the link between healthy transition grants that are involved with children's mental health systems and how they interact with things like employment and schooling in the community. And so far, the finding is that they don't. Statistically, they don't, that they're involved purely on clinical levels. So if we're talking about social capital, particularly for young folks, we're talking about environments where they want to find folks, school, employment. So we have to think not just in terms of the clinical end about client X and what's his or her need for social capital, but how do we develop these structures which really inhibit the formation of social capital, even for individuals who might naturally be inclined or able to develop it. So let me end with that, and now we're going to have Angie. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oops.
Whoops. Oh,
The hazards. Thank you so much, Joe. So let's turn to some Q&A for all of our panelists here. Again, we're going to alternate from those in the audience here in the DC office as well as individuals online. We've got a microphone that we're going to come around with. So when you get the microphone, please state your name and affiliation, and then speak into the microphone so we can record you for the webinar audience. Let's start with something here in the room. I believe we have a question right here.
My name is Stephen Sturm. I'm an economics professor at the University of Virginia. I have one or two questions about the survey for disability and employment. One issue is it available for researchers outside of the government or Mathematica? And the other is whether you have any notion of how severe or in what direction selection bias associated with only interviewing people who walk through the door of a VR agency looks like.
Sure, I'll start with that.
Okay.
I'm going to speak to the second question first about selection bias. So we focused on VR applicants as a sample to learn more. One, because we knew that by applying for VR, they're demonstrating an interest in employment. And two, we thought talking to them would give us we're interested in talking to individuals before they're maybe reliant on Social Security disability benefits. Having said that, you can't generalize from a population of VR applicants to all individuals with disabilities. So we didn't even try and assess, selection bias because they're just different populations. So within the context of VR applicants, our response rate was about, I think, 56%. And we did do a study to look at any non-response bias. One of the things that's worth mentioning is that in the SDE, about a third of the respondents are employed at application. There are, a non-trivial number, if you look at the RSA 911, of VR applicants nationwide that are employed at application. It is lower than the number in the sample. So we did get a higher response among individuals who are employed at application than those who are not. With respect,
Take the second part of the question. So currently the way that the data set is set up is that individuals who want to use the data set are working with one of the investigators on the grant. So it's currently not a public use data set. But there are opportunities for the future to either think about expanding this to other states or so forth. So it's something John O'Neill and us here at Mathematica are going to work out.
If I could just mention about the applicants, that's one of the issues in terms of the differences among voc rehab agencies, because applicant is an official status, if you will, in the system when they begin to capture people. And even of those agencies, but all the 50, some are very aggressive in terms of outreach. So they would get people who are applicants who may or may not be eager to work or pounding down the door. Some of the other agencies are they're hard to find, and unless someone finds them and is very motivated to find them. So even though they're all applicants in the system, the individual approach to seeking out new clients and also how much money they have and a variety of other issues really varies. So it's not just walking in the door.
Is a question from the webinar, Carmen?
Yes, there is. This question comes from Glenn Maneker, and it came in during Purvi's presentation. The data seems to look at individuals with physical and psychiatric disabilities. What about those with intellectual or developmental disabilities? Were they included in the data sets?
Sure. The survey we sampled all VR applicants. The findings I presented today were from a paper that was specifically comparing individuals who reported psychiatric impairments or physical impairments. Some of those may be people who also had sensory impairments, but we didn't focus on that subpopulation in this study, though those individuals are in the data.
We have a question up here in front.
Hi, I'm Joanne Schneider, George Washington University and Chrysalis Collaborations. And I also know VR from the inside as well as outside as a person with lifelong disabilities that are not psychiatric. Okay. First of all, thanks for the last person. That was one of my questions. I'd love to hear about the IDD data later. The question I want to aim at Debra and Purvi, but I suspect, Joe, you have something to say about it as well, is let's talk about the way you guys define social capital and where you're going next. Because I loved the way you did this in terms of questions, but as we know, for those of us who've been doing research in this field for a while, help in finding a job with employment and social capital really depends on the kind of help and whether it's the right kind of help to get to the right kind of job. So I'm wondering if you had any more data on whether the person who could help someone find a job was their counselor, their parent, someone in the field they wanted to work with, or anything like that.
I believe the survey has a question asking, I don't remember the exact wording, but how supportive are different people in your life around employment? Or have they suggested that?
Supportive of your.
And I think it has different types of people in your life, your family members, your counselor. You guys may know they designed the survey, so.
Family members, spouses, a colleague, a friend, someone in the community.
So it is possible to look
disaggregate.
at that.
But let me ask a follow-up on that. If it's, as we all know, it isn't just, oh, yes, I support you in finding the job, pat. It's, I have the skills and the resources and the networks to get you a job. So do you have that information on these folks as well, or is it just, I have this person who's supporting me?
We don't. We did ask individuals how they found their job, their last job. And we, for most of the questions in the survey, respondents were able to answer open-endedly. So there's quite a bit of detail with a lot to learn from. Yeah.
Great. I'd love to see the next step.
Great. I believe we have another question online.
We do. This comes from Noelle Kurth, and it speaks to, I think, the methodology question that Purvi was just talking about. Can someone briefly talk about the STE methodology, individual versus in-person interviews with a short answer or open-ended protocol done by paper or pencil?
It was what we call a CATI, computer-assisted telephone interview. So we, our survey operations center here at Mathematica was responsible for calling individuals on the telephone and going through a computerized instrument. Many of the questions, there are a lot of standardized questions from other surveys, such as HRS, Health and Retirement Survey, American Community Survey, as well as a few questions we wrote on our own. A lot of them were also coded after the fact, so the individual was allowed to self-report their limitation. So we did some work to code those. And then, so it was kind of a combination of pre-coded answers as well as self-report. Was there anything else to the question?
No, that was it.
Right here up front, we've got the microphone.
Hello, my name is Rebecca Sheffield. I work at the American Foundation for the Blind, and not very familiar with VR data. So I'm wondering, because I know that some states have separate state agencies that work with people who are blind or visually impaired set as apart from the regular VR agency. And so I'm wondering if the data from the those separate blind and visual impaired agencies would show up in both in the paired data research and in the Survey of Disability and Employment, or if it was just the main Voc Rehab agency for the state.
So I can start with that. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There are general, combined, and VR agencies that serve consumers who are blind. And in many of the studies, the VR agencies that are included are just a general or combined as opposed to the blind agencies, in part because when you match the data and you're talking about SSI and SSDI clients, the sample sizes get really small. And it is, researchers are restricted from reporting very, very small sample sizes. So that's one reason. But that being said, I think the blind serving agencies are like really, really important, and it's important to share what data we can about them. So in one of the studies that I mentioned that is forthcoming, we analyze data on the general agencies, but we're doing an additional analysis specifically on outcomes for the blind serving agencies, and we'll be putting those out as briefs, so smaller documents that are more portable, accessible, that we can disseminate to VR agencies, et cetera. So that's what we're doing.
One of the issues to keep in mind in terms of the visual impairment services, outside of the structure that Frank mentioned, is that unlike the overall Voc Rehab, the funding for blind services, which is always separate, even in the combined agency, is a very comparably small percentage is devoted to employment stuff. Most of the money, the highest percentage of money in blind service agencies is really to mobility impairment, elder services, children's services. So the whole idea of finding employment is actually, with the great majority of blind service agencies, VR blind service agencies, is a much smaller percentage of what they do than it would be in the general Voc Rehab agency.
I was going to speak to the SDE sample. So in Mississippi and Ohio, the agency is a combined agency. In New Jersey, we just surveyed the general agency, not the blind.
Great. Is there other questions online, or?
Yes, there is. This one is for Joe. It comes from Lou Adams. He asks, what do you think the common measures in WIOA will give us that we have not had before, and how can we use it to drive positive changes in VR?
For those who don't know, I assume most of you know, WIOA is the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, which is basically the new Workforce Act, but incorporated within it are the amendments basically to the Rehab Act of 1973. So it's the governing authority for Voc Rehab agencies. The regulations aren't written yet, but in the law it basically talked about common measures across all systems. Things like how long people retain jobs, increase in earnings for youth, acquisition of skills or certificates. One of the concerns of Voc Rehab systems is our people are different. You can't count them the same way as you count the general population. You know, and you can make a case either way. My own opinion is that focusing on the common measures makes perfect sense. If we're talking about the ADA, if we're talking about people being citizens, we should be talking about how the performance of people with disabilities relates to the economy as a whole and citizenry as a whole. The downside, of course, is people are worried about their funding. They're worried if it gets sort of lumped together and the numbers are poor compared to the general population, that in fact people will be left out. People won't have enough programs to serve them. The regulations aren't out yet, so that'll really be the test. But I think the direction of common measures is actually good. Now, people generally like the philosophy but don't trust the implementation. That's basically what's going to happen. So, but as a philosophical point of view, I think common measures make perfect sense to really, because look at the outcomes that Purvi, Debra, Frank mentioned. You know, they're really terrible for a lot of reasons, and a lot of the reasons have nothing to do with the people or the deficits of the people. So unless we have external pressures, even if the pressures aren't necessarily the best way to do it, I think we're, you know, once again, I come from the South Bronx, so I'm into external pressure. Change only happens. I tell people change only happens with three things in systems of people. You need to create hope in systems and people. You need to give people concrete help, and you need to hassle people. Unless hope, help, and hassling are all in place, nothing will change. And frankly, WIOA is a little bit of the hassling.
All right, well, who can we hassle next in the audience here? We've got a question up front here. The microphone's coming.
Lauren Obler with the Government Accountability Office, and I guess kind of a follow-up question about to the earlier question about WIOA. And I know that another of the changes in WIOA is to kind of encourage or prompt the state VR agencies to, I guess, treat employers as a customer in addition to the the clients receiving services, and kind of allowing them, or I don't know if it's allowing or encouraging them to use some of their funds for the kind of outreach and technical assistance. I'm just curious, and I'm still trying to understand the VR program better, but is that seen by VR agencies as a major change or shift? I don't know if anyone has anything to say about sort of the opportunities or challenges with that. Do you think that's going to be a major change? And I guess that's pretty much it.
Well, I'll start. Well, most VR agencies do outreach to employers. That's part of its important role of job placement and job services. They need to, many of the individuals are members of local chambers of commerce. They network with employers. So that's, demand side approaches to VR services is sort of an emerging and important strategy as opposed to supply side where you're focusing on a client. So I think that's certainly the case as well. Joe might have some other insight on that.
I mean, as Frank said, you could probably, if you want to do research, the first articles in the rehab literature about demand side are probably now 40 years old, or at least 35 years old. So this idea about you have to meet the employer's needs as well as the client's needs, it's been around. The two big differences in WIOA is they want you, in fact, to measure the success. So a lot of agencies, what's different is a lot of agencies have had job placement people interspersed. More of them are creating business relations unit to do more global marketing. I guess as someone who's run both an employment service and does a lot of technical assistance, the dilemma becomes when people do generic marketing, you're in Alabama, you go to Huntsville, Alabama, and the NASA folks there say we need 40 software engineers. They go back to the Voc Rehab agency, and the Voc Rehab agency said, we don't have any software engineers. Then the people who do business relations get mad at the clients, so to speak. You don't have the right clients. One of the dangers of someone who's actually run a unit is there's a little bit of the Stockholm syndrome that goes on. People who do business relations eventually see themselves as protecting the danger is they see themselves as protecting the employer more than advocating for the client. So when you're actually operationalizing it, you have to take what's basically a good idea, which is you can't get a job without an employer who has a need, but to say that the ultimate goal is that you're advocating for people who have needs that may not fit neatly. So how are you going to help them with it? I guess I'll just end with I've never been a dual customer. I wrote an article a few years ago when talked about customer service. And one of the things I said was there can only be one customer. That's the person whose needs you meet. There are a lot of stakeholders you need whose needs you need to meet to get the customer the job. And the analogy I use is real estate. If you work with a realtor who's helping you to sell your house, that person has to satisfy a buyer and a seller. But the ultimate fiduciary responsibility is to the seller. So one of the things I think Voc Rehab agencies are struggling with as dual customer becomes a trendy thing, is to say, how do we balance our need? In fact, a lot of people get discriminated against still. A lot of people don't fit neatly. By the same token, there are legitimate needs employers have, and Voc Rehab counselors and clients have to understand how to meet those needs. So that's the struggle. But I think at a structural level, the major two things that are happening, more business relations units, and people with struggling with the WIOA requirement that you measure the success of your business relations efforts, which people don't quite know how to do.
Thank you. I believe we have one more question online.
Yes, we do. This question comes from Michael Stepansky. It came in during Purvi's presentation. What is the intervariable correlation among reasons people reported that they were not working?
We did not calculate that, but if you're really interested in it, feel free to email me and I can do that for you.
Okay, we have a question in the back of the room here. I believe the microphone is, Dave's going for it.
Dave Stapleton, Mathematica. So I just wanted to comment on this is really partly an answer to the WIOA question. It goes a little bit beyond what Joe said. I think one of the things that WIOA did was to really reaffirm to VR agencies that they could help people who were working and keep their jobs, as opposed to help people who weren't working get their jobs. And I think that has stimulated interest in the VR agencies and CSA VR about how to do that better. And there are some states that had been doing that fairly aggressively before, but we've seen some indications of other states growing interest in that.
I believe there's a question right behind you in the room here.
Hi, Cheryl Bates-Harris from the National Disability Rights Network. And I had a question going back to your questions around accommodations at work. I see no mention of assistive technology, and yet that is so critical for many, many disability populations. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that, please.
Sure. In the survey, we do have a series of questions about assistive technology that's asked to all of the respondents, not just individuals with certain types of disabilities. And I didn't fold that into that slide on accommodations, but you're right, it is a very important accommodation.
In the back?
Curtis Richards with the Institute for Educational Leadership and the Voc Rehab sponsored Youth Technical Assistance Center. Joe, it's always entertaining and great to hear you voice your opinion, because I find myself agreeing with you so much. The conversation about social capital I'm quite intrigued with, and again, Joe, I appreciate your drawing the distinction for folks about social capital for young people versus the rest of us grayheads. But what I'm curious about is again on the accommodations at work. I think one of the last two presenters mentioned a 30% number of support from while at work, and I'm curious if you've got that broken down as to what kinds of supports they're getting from their colleagues.
I'll answer that. So the way it was reported here was assistance from coworkers. And as Angie mentioned earlier, for a number of these questions, we asked in an open-ended way and allowed respondents to report. And so we coded up into this category of assistance from coworkers. Within there's substantial range in what people reported. And so while I don't have that with me, we can talk about it further, because we could dig deeper to see what kinds of assistance people reported.
Okay, I think we've got one more on the web.
We do.
And still time.
This question comes from Robert DeMicholas. I liked your use of demographic versus disability diagnosis, yet are the types of recognized disability categories available, i.e. which disability group is the largest VR customer, which disability is the VR agency serving the best or worst?
So the VR data does include information on primary type of impairment, primary cause of disability. So you can generate descriptive statistics on the population on that. The Social Security Administration data also includes information on disability characteristics. The two systems don't always align together. So a disability diagnosis in VR might be different than the disability diagnosis that you get from the Social Security data. So sometimes you have to work with trying to reconcile those. But given the data sets, you can analyze based on individual characteristics such as disability and different outcomes. More often than not, those characteristics are used in models to control for the outcomes, particularly when you're looking at policy-based questions. But that's also doable. There's some analyses that look at characteristics and outcomes as well. So that's doable.
Okay, I'd like to give a round of thanks and to our presenters and panelists today. Thank you for joining us today for a wonderful, informative, and lively discussion. If you have further questions, maybe we can have the panelists stick around and ask them. We'd also appreciate it if you'd let them know what you think of the session today. There's a comment card in your packet, as well as an electronic survey for our webinar audience. And we'd like to remind you to save the date for the Disability Research Consortium annual meeting, which is coming up here in DC on August the 3rd. Thank you, everyone.